What I'd like to discuss today is how we as Reformed Jews conceptualize and implement the fourth commandment, observing the Sabbath and keeping it holy. So first, I thought I'd present at least a little background and start with how Shabbat is presented in the Torah. Obviously, it starts right in the beginning, Bereshis, the seventh day of creation. And I think we probably all heard on Friday nights the prayer, Vayechulu hashamayim b'haaretz, v'yachal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i malachto asher aseh by Shabbat. So Shabbat is the word that's used for God ceasing creation. There's no mention about Sabbath yet. There's no mention about rest. It's just God ceased creation. Nothing else is talked about until the next book of the Torah, Shemot, Exodus, when the first presentation of the Ten Commandments takes place, and God says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Remember is the first presentation of the commandment. But again, in this case, work is implied to be prohibited, but mainly it's commemorating God's creation of the work of creation. And then later on in Exodus, it starts getting more explicit. On the seventh day, you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, Shabbat Shabbaton, and holy to the Lord. So that's the first mention of rest in connection with the fourth commandment. And there are also the first mention of consequences, namely death. That takes place again and again in the Torah. Probably the most stark example is a man is carrying sticks and the directive is stone him to death. I have no idea why he was carrying sticks, whether he was in need of money for sticks, whatever. It's just carrying sticks. And then later on in Deuteronomy, it starts getting more open to interpretation, I guess, where remember is changed to observe. Observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. So it's not just implied to be remembrance, it's not just implied do no work. God talks about some kind of observation, which is left blank, whether that implies participation or whether it implies just some kind of mental recognition isn't specified. So the idea of what does it mean to observe as opposed to remember still is vague at this point. And that's about as specific as it gets. So let's move ahead to how this commandment has been implemented in real life. It's a way of talking about Jewish laws that presents some with a term called apodictic, which means clearly demonstrated. So a commandment is absolute. Thou shalt not kill. The other ones of the 600 or so mitzvahs, many of them are casuistic, which means case-oriented. So you apply an absolute principle to a modern day circumstance and try to gain some kind of guidance that way. So for example, the Ten Commandments are apodictic. The separation of meat and dairy is casuistic. In the Torah, it says, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, or don't boil a calf in its mother's milk. And that goes on to be interpreted as the laws of separating meat and dairy. But considering Sabbath and keeping it holy as absolute, it's still somewhat vague about how to implement that. We can cease work, but then what does one actually do? And then the next question is who actually decides it? Well, again, God doesn't give us any more guidance besides ceasing work, remembering, and observing. Talmudic scholars try to give a little more guidance, and I'm not sure that was particularly helpful. They derived a series of melachot, where melacha is commonly translated as work, although some people think its better definition is some kind of definite activity or skill or craftsmanship. And they derived 39 categories of work. And at that time, what was there to work on? Well, people at this time, the Torah was presented to us. What did they work on? They didn't have to work on food. Manna was delivered to them. Of course, they got a double portion on Friday, so the rest on Shabbat meant not gathering manna. But what kind of work did they actually have to do? So the Talmudic scholars made up this list of 39 items. Sowing, reaping, binding, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, shearing, washing, beating, dyeing, making two loops, weaving two threads, separating two threads. The legend, so to speak, is that they decided that categories of work meant what our ancestors had to do in finishing the tabernacle. And those became prescribed activities. So I'm going to give you an example now where that became somewhat ridiculous. So, and this is a real life example. So taking winnowing and selecting. In the Talmudic sense, that refers to any separation of intermixed materials. Mm-hmm. And it also applies to picking small bones from fish. So that's how the custom of gefilte fish got started. It became work to pick bones from fish. So serving gefilte fish on Shabbat was apparently one solution to the problem of not doing any work. Here's a paragraph from Wikipedia. With gefilte fish being a Sabbath dinner staple and the commandment in Genesis for fish to be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas, fish at Sabbath meals took on the patina of an aphrodisiac, the sages believing that the intoxicating odor of fish on the Sabbath table would encourage couples to be fruitful and multiply, which the Jewish tradition is encouraged on Friday night.
Is multiplying considered work as well?
No, it's not. Be fruitful and multiply is Kabbalistic commandment. Yeah.
So that even on the Sabbath.
Yeah, that
I think especially on this.
yeah, and even the double mitzvah is referred to, Friday night. I at my brother's wedding, my part of the toast, and I said that I told him and my sister-in-law to go forth and multiply, and his answer was he never batted cleanup before. So going forth wasn't his deal. So still not much of an answer from Talmud. God isn't providing any further guidance in modern times. Talmudic guidance is pretty anachronistic. So I think that the guidance that everybody in this room would probably accept best is that we as individuals have to decide for ourselves. I can answer for myself. And then we can discuss how each of you conceptualize and observes the Sabbath, keeping it holy. Certainly, it's easy day of rest. I avoid the ordinary and the menial, perhaps embrace the spiritual. But for me, the Sabbath has always been a reward for finishing the week and an oasis from worry. For example, in high school and college, I didn't do any homework on the weekends or studying on Saturday. But still, that's not much of an answer. That's what kind of not to do. So I came to the conclusion for me that things that are fun or relaxing or even invigorating that might technically qualify as work, for me, should be conceptualized as maybe not only permissible, but encouraged in the interest of spiritual growth. But my one moment of guidance was when I was in 7th grade. I grew up in a neighborhood where my development wasn't particularly Jewish, neighborhood across town, all Jewish. And we didn't go to school together. There were separate elementary schools. We got together in junior high. We knew each other sort of from Little League and whatever. But when I got to 7th grade, I met this whole new cadre of kids who were Jewish. And they were gonna be my friends for the rest of school. So everybody had just been bar mitzvahed. These guys, the guys I was closest to, started a bowling team on Saturdays. And I asked my father if I could go join the bowling league with these friends. I had been going to shul with him every Saturday for as far back as I can remember. And originally he said no. And then kind of by the end of the fall season, he said, sure, you can. And I found out pretty quickly that I really missed going to shul with my father. It was, just the nicest, most pleasant, happiest moment of my life. And even though these kids were all good friends by this time in bowling league, it wasn't that I didn't like bowling too much or that I couldn't bowl very well. It was that I really missed going to shul with my father. So that kind of defined it for me. Things that make something that makes me feel good about myself. And that's kind of how I learned to conceptualize it. As far as the issue of active versus inactive, you don't work, but what do you do? One of the things that hit me was when I was a little older and heard for the first time proverbial Grateful Dead song Ripple, which combines active and inactive, especially in the refrain. Ripples on still water where there's no pebble tossed or wind to blow. And the rest of that song really seems to imply how one chooses a path to follow in life. And it's very meaningful for me when I think about my sons. But what was read this morning in the Haftorah is much more of a directive about active versus passive. It sort of foreshadows Jesus, who considered Sabbath to be a time for a great activity, and he was kind of persecuted for that. And of course, in the New Testament, it was excused as all deeds of good. That is what it is. But what Isaiah said this morning, share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless into your house, cover the naked, remove lawlessness from your midst, satisfy the needs of the afflicted, rebuild the ancient ruins on the foundation of ages past. If you keep from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own affairs on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, then you shall delight in the eternal one. I will make you rise upon the heights of the earth, and I will feed you with the portion of Jacob your father. So when I was preparing this talk, the conclusion for me of the ideal Sabbath rest and activity put together: be with my people, let my imagination run free, be on the lookout for my aha moment to unlock whatever mysteries or activities are going to illuminate my path going forward. And that's the way I conceptualize it. That's the way I kind of live it. And to me, it doesn't matter whether you have to drive or not drive, whatever. It's a spiritual experience, not a technical one. So we'll throw it open now for how what you'd like to discuss about how you conceptualize and implement the Sabbath.
Here's a question. So I'm learning like the conservative movement and the reform movement, they have different ideas. Like we talk about, like, when we do the Kiddush, we do a prayer for those who didn't have a Kiddush before. Is there in the reform movement talk about what they think is the proper way to observe the Sabbath?
No idea. I don't know that.
Is anybody?
I know that if you can't get to Chabad on Saturday without driving, they tell you drive. Joyce was taking.
That's kind of what your answer actually, a regular question. We all know whether it's Shabbat elevators in certain hospitals and things like that. How did what you said morph into interpretations that interpret that you can't use any modern convenience? So you have to live your life like it was the day the Torah came down from Mount Sinai. But how did it morph into that? And when did that? I just imagine in the modern world, people
Well, that's the irony. If this is an apodictic law, that's an absolute command, how does it then become one that has become just subject to interpretation? There's no,
How they interpreted it morph over the years from, from the, I'm gonna assume, because I didn't grow up Orthodox, big Orthodox, I did have relatives who. They weren't getting into a car on Shabbat, they weren't gonna, use an elevator,
I have the picture of rabbis sitting around each on top each other, like
done
in the
it well.
Seder's. An outstretched arm, and fingers, an outstretched arm and, two arms and whatever. Joyce took some classes at the Plainview Chabad. And one year said, why don't we go to Purim there instead of here? Let's see what it's like. So she called up and the rabbis, she's uncomfortable with Makita, so she asked the rabbi, did men and women sit separately? And the rabbi said, yes, we did. First he said, I can't believe your husband's so crazy about you, he can't stand to sit separately from you, but I don't think that was really
That'd be nasty first.
whatever. So then he called her back within a few minutes and said, you know what? If you and your husband will come, men and women can sit together.
He sat on the lady's side.
There was no side. The Black Hat boys had their own Megillah reading in a separate room, and everybody else with families sat together without it. And it was a very dry.
Look at you breaking that.
You started a new trend there.
It was a very dry experience for me. There was some kind of custom with buying back half silver, half dollars. I asked kids what the meaning of this was. They didn't know. The rabbi said 3 Hamans and that's it. And then we just go on reading. It's just, maybe it was conforming or not conforming with traditions or laws or whatever, but it was an emotionally empty experience. I know I asked my friends from JJC about certain observations, and the best answer I get is because you're supposed to. And I go berserk at that answer. First of all, you're supposed to, based on some old guy in Poland in 1850s, I don't know, but that you're supposed to, I just can't handle that reason, or that type of reason. Like when I'm teaching my residents psychopharm, why did you do that? And they say, because that's the way we do it around here. Again, I go berserk about that. I'm willing to listen to any reason and think about any reason, accept any reason, but no reason because you're supposed to. I don't just take that passively.
I know I used to work on Saturdays, and the thought of making that a different day never occurred to me. It changed a little bit, but something Rabbi David said once in one of his speeches, and this is how I do the Sabbath, because obviously tomorrow I'll be apple picking, on Saturday I'll be apple picking with my grandkids, and I don't rest and whatever. But he said, if you can't do anything, and this is one that I stay off social media, just make it a little different. And I said, darn, that is a great idea. And I have done that, and I have found that to be such a comforting day that I don't go on any of that stuff. I don't read any of that stuff. And that was his, if you don't do anything, just pick one thing that maybe you do the other 6 days that aggravate you, and don't do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even the Shabbos elevator thing. So I got on in my office building in Great Neck, and with 4 other guys, and all Jewish, of various ages. I was kind of in the middle, and everybody pressed the buttons. All the buttons were pushed. So I said out loud, boy, it's a local. And the oldest guy said, no, it's a Shabbos elevator. So it wasn't Shabbos, we weren't observing whatever, but it certainly was a bonding that occurred between those 4, we 4 guys. We all knew each other was talking about. And whether anybody observed that on Shabbos, whether anybody rode in an elevator or not on Shabbos, everybody kind of felt good with that man's observation. So the idea of making it a special day.
Somehow, whoever it is,
Yeah, and it's nothing you feel is restrictive, you feel it's enlightening.
You're in Manhattan Hospital, that, 30, 40 floors, go longer.
That's right, my brother was in NYU 20 years ago, and her room was like, it's like.
Mount Sinai Hospital has a Shabbat. You don't even push buttons.
LIJ does also. LIJ does also.
So does Parker,
Yeah.
your officer at Parker.
Yeah.
So I really like your idea. I actually do that for Yom Kippur.
Which is fine, it's with the rabbis, I
Okay.
don't want to take
All
credit.
right, well, you brought it up.
Okay, good.
And,
Okay.
and I did that on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. And that would be.
And no TV.
And no
either.
TV, it drives her crazy. I said, just leave the TV off for a day. And that
Right,
seems
right,
like a
it's
good,
fine,
good
it's fine.
start. Now, I have a brother who's modern Orthodox, and he does not drive, and he sort of has a nice life. They have a community, and they all get together, and they hang out, and they do that. That's the way he brought up his children, and that's wonderful. And sometimes I'm jealous, like we go to visit
Nice,
him,
they have a nice.
we have to park
community.
outside and walk inside, and and you have to be careful not to put on the lights, but but it's a nice community. It's a nice feeling. There's no way I could get there. I mean, there's just no way. I just, and what the rabbi was saying just now, I mean, to me, I like to go outside. I like to be with nature, is that something that is work? If I cut a twig off a plant, I mean, is that something that is frowned upon? And that's something, I need to think of,
Well, if you choose to be in a reformed temple, then it's whatever you think is right.
Right.
That's the whole idea of a reformed temple.
Right.
You disagree?
Yeah.
That's a little bit of an,
Okay,
well,
no, please.
no, I think do whatever you think. If it's all just personal, then you're not in a congregation, you're in yourself, that statement. So
Right.
I have removed myself from, because I don't want to be part of some rules, but just the statement,
Okay,
I have been a member here and still am technically, but the point of this was that I have a little bit of a statement that just do what you want or your own person. If it's all just your own person, my understanding, Rabbi Judy used to say, it has to be backed up with some connection to the, I don't know what rules and regs is not the right word, but some tradition or something
okay.
within the system.
Yeah.
You can't be just, I feel it because it's right for me. At least that's my own.
That's fair.
Yes.
I think this is a very interesting point that relates to some of the texts today. Because a lot of the text, particularly the portion from the Haftorah, was about free will. This is an issue that for me is very fundamental. Because essentially, the way I look at it, is that God did two things. He said, you as human beings have free will to choose. This is what I want you to choose, but you have the free will not to choose. And if you choose not to choose it, there are real consequences to not choosing it, but you still have the free will to choose it. And the entire history of humanity is about choice.
Yep.
It's about choices made and choices not made, but primarily choices made. Choices made to do evil or choices made to do good. God, according to our tradition, set up some very simple guidelines. Of course, in the latter several books of the Torah, there were very specific guidelines that have nothing to do with the way we live today. But the fundamental guidance in Exodus is pretty clear. And therefore, I think the freedom of choice is the issue and what we're going to choose. And that's really what the text was about today. One thing I would disagree with you about, the text, the Ten Commandments does not say do not kill.
Right.
It specifically says do not murder, which is a very different thing. Because you have permission to kill under certain circumstances. Self-defense. Perhaps we could debate what's going on in Gaza. But murder is specifically prohibited and specifically defined later on in the Torah. So I think for me, in trying to find a common denominator between what you two gentlemen said, is this idea of free will and choice. There is guidance for what we're supposed to choose. I, for one, have been very frail in making right choices over my life. I have made some very bad choices, but I knew what was right and I didn't do it. That's really where we are as human beings.
There's actually a type of evolution that goes on in the Torah where God eventually gets to the point where free will is permissible.
Right.
And in the beginning, it wasn't so. God kind of matured and said, well, I've worked with these people, you know, about the best I can get out of them is let them choose.
Right.
I disagree with you because right in Genesis, Adam and Eve had free choice. God, yes, they do. God said to them, don't eat this fruit. But they had the ability to do it. So they had free will even at that stage. They'd made the wrong choice. So they had a consequence for that choice. They were expelled from the garden. So even in the very beginning of humanity, there was a choice. They had free will and they made a bad choice. God gave them the ability to choose. That's the fundamental human dilemma. We have the ability to choose, and what are we going to choose? It's what every human being is facing, whether it's Netanyahu or Trump or anyone is facing these choices every minute of the day.
At so many moments in the Torah, God had to be basically talked out of wiping everybody out and starting all over again.
Yes, but people had the choice to do well, because God, in a certain element of religion, which is a predeterministic religion, which probably nobody in the Reform movement believes in. Everything is predetermined by God, but that's not our religion. Our religion from the very beginning gave us the choice to choose good or evil, right from Adam and Eve. And so free will is the issue.
So,
Between you.
I just have a question about Adam and Eve, and it's interesting because I just had the conversation with two of my grandchildren on Rosh Hashanah about it, and we talked about the story. I'm not sure that was the wrong decision, because it was the tree of knowledge.
Right.
It was knowledge they were going for. So I hear what you're saying. There's an argument, and my son who was there, he said, "Oh, that's what we were taught in Hebrew school. You know, that was the wrong decision." And I'm not sure it was. It was
Historically,
reaching
no,
out.
it was the right decision.
Well,
It was the right decision for humanity.
right.
But it's very interesting. It's very interesting. This, depending on how you look at these stories, they're very interesting. For example, we did this Isaac and Abraham story. It's a very interesting dynamic there, because somebody very smart once said to me, story seems to imply that God is testing Abraham. But wasn't it really that Abraham was testing God? Abraham had no intention of killing his son. Abraham was testing God and deciding if this was a God he wanted to believe in. So you can look at these stories from many different perspectives, as you
I
said.
like that perspective.
Abraham had no intention of killing his son?
That's an interpretation that's
That's-
very interesting to look at.
That's
not
fascinating.
apparent.
That's not apparent in the Torah. And as far as your free choice is concerned, I thought where you were going is, if you don't have knowledge, how can you have choice?
Can't, that's why it's the right
So,
decision
no,
for
no,
humanity.
no. So Adam and Eve did not have knowledge. So how did they have free will? They didn't have knowledge.
Because they could choose between eating the apple or not.
Without knowledge.
Yes, they had knowledge.
The only knowledge is what God commanded.
Right.
No,
They-
did they
they
want
had
the apple or
knowledge.
not?
They had knowledge that they could live in nirvana for eternity, or
Eat the apple.
eat the apple.
They
That
made a
was-
choice.
My interpret,
They chose the apple because snake convinced them and it should taste
But there's always a snake trying to convince you to do evil. We have a choice to accept the snake or not.
Oh, okay, so yeah, that choice, but the choice wasn't based on knowledge.
No, by definition, they didn't have knowledge. Think of what it would mean to not have knowledge.
I think it was the right choice for humans.
Different story. We're here because, well, under the theme of.
It's
But not
very-
having
But all
no-
this is so fascinating.
Yeah, but that's that's the
That's
story
the
of
point.
God's Torah,
Right.
choices. Apple, Tower of Babel, golden calf, and eventually God says, you know what? I've had enough. Here it is.
Tell me more about, you said God changes. In Exodus, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So Pharaoh says, let him go. And then it says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So God doesn't give Pharaoh free choice. He forces him to do the storyline, which then leads on. So when does it change that God says, let them do what they need to do to be?
I get the sense that although you can't understand God as having human emotions,
Right.
that there are many instances where Moses basically talks God down or re-encourages him to, let's keep going at this, let's not blow it up and start it all over again.
And so did Abraham try to talk God down on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? He didn't succeed.
Find me 50 righteous people.
Yeah.
So is the Torah's story of our ancestors' maturation? Well, you can look at it that way. I in Torah class week to week, my bent on it is usually the story of God's maturation. And then saying, you have your choice. I use with my patients very frequently one of two analogies. It's like somebody, the lifeguard throws you a life preserver and you don't want to grab it. Or a slightly different circumstance. This is what I think is the best treatment course for you. Don't tell me somebody has to go up on a mountain and bring it back for you and to go across the sea and bring it back for you. You can do this, you can make the choice. And we'll talk about the reasons for the choice. But the idea is people have the choice.
But they have a choice of what they eat, they have a choice of going to the gym or not, they have a choice of what they do, and they have a choice of what they can do on the Sabbath or not.
Right.
But there are certain guidances, as you pointed out. For me, it's about not doing the work that you do to make a living.
I like that.
So, if you make a living building buildings, that's not what you do on the Sabbath. I want to ask you a question on the evolution of Sabbath in different religions. Because Muslims, Christians, and Jews all observe the Sabbath, you can all accept the fact fundamentally the Ten Commandments. But how did it come to pass that Muslims pick Friday and Christians pick Sunday and Jews have Saturday?
Something I know nothing about.
Because someone's got to work at the hospitals on Saturday.
I think part of it, at least for me, seemed to be, Catholics, the timing of it was the Jews had Friday and Saturday. So
We don't
somebody
want
had
to
to
be
pick-
that, we're not
we're
that.
not doing that. So the Christians picked Sunday, they were next, I guess. in terms of
Muslims
evolution.
said, we're not doing those things.
So the Muslims got Friday.
Yes.
It's a good reason to have three religions.
I have to leave in a couple of minutes, so I got a desk to run. But I just wanted to invite you all, we do Torah study Shabbat morning on Zoom,
It's wonderful.
at 10:30. It's a legacy from Rabbi Judy when she left. No one else wanted to do it, and I stepped forward, I knew nothing. So you can
Oh.
join the group, I facilitated.
And we have these kind of discussions every
Oh.
Saturday morning, and no matter how much we disagree, we're all smiling and all friends.
And everything is Torah, somehow the craziest things.
I just said to her, I said, this is like our class. We started talking about what we do on on the Sabbath, and now we're talking about was Abraham gonna sacrifice his son? I said, we just segued right to that.
I think the next slide is for question
great
is
book.
the nature of God and everybody's perception of God.
Well,
That's
talk
the,
about all-
that up to an hour easy.
But
Yeah,
I
let's spend the
to-
next rest of the day with
It's,
that.
it's in the licks of the week, every week, on Saturday morning at 10:30, run from 10:30 to 12. And even if the Torah portion,
Yeah.
like last week, we were done with reading, because we read the Torah in English. Start to finish, taking turns. This past Shabbat, we were done reading the Torah in about a half an hour, right?
But we were lucky to finish at noon.
But we went all the way to noon because there were questions that I find online that things that we talk about, usually related to the Torah portion that has, like I said, that evokes responses. That's
Just
what-
check the emails, the Zoom information is right there. So,
He just.
Where is it? Where's
so
it?
you get each working on temple the weekend there'll be a Torah study and a Zoom room for it. And I don't know, does the weekly word have it as well? I'm not sure if the weekly word has it, but at least you'll get at least something with.
The Zoom links,
And
we
the
get
same link every week.
the same, we do,
What
we have the link.
Saturday?
10:30 to
10:30.
I said I'll be picking out.
Start with the Torah portion for the week and then it evolves into whatever.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
But actually, it can evolve as we go, because we don't just read through without stopping. We might read and someone say, wait a second, I want to discuss something, and then that discussion could lead to 3 tangents, and then it's 20 minutes later, and we say, okay, now continue.
Well, people have different versions of the portion. And if there are footnotes and gleanings and.
Right.
And some people will read in advance and talk about it.
And everybody's got- Like here, everybody's got
Bunch of
different backgrounds, so everybody brings a whole different.
So.
So when we go back to people describing how they conceptualize and put into practice
Forgive me.
their own Sabbath.
I'll sign it.
I would go.
I not like, I figure, like for a long time, I wasn't part of the mainstream, so I can't just take off on Shabbat. And if I'm scheduled for work, I don't have that power because I, some sex with my boss that I could take off Saturday. Like it's not within my powers. I do some observance, like go to Friday night. And I go to the bottom on Saturday, Shabbat, then in the afternoon, I'm always working on that shop. I don't have that power.
Do you feel it's a special day?
Some ways.
Separating the work from the Sabbath, say.
In some ways, it's distinct, special. But, like, that's why I'm reformed, I can follow all the, like, 613 commandments from the letter, that I don't have that. I'll not within my lifestyle. Have to worry about other things.
But Julian, you have a way of observing the Sabbath. You come almost every Friday night, right?
Yeah, but I can't, I take off from work.
Okay, so. Situation doesn't mean that you don't observe the way you observe the Sabbath.
Yeah, I don't observe it to the letter.
Still, none of us do.
What letter?
Yeah, so we all have
What
different
letter?
letters. So
We have different.
No, like I don't, that's.
Yeah, that's.
No, like I don't, like you're supposed to rest, you're not supposed to work, you're supposed to, I go to work in shop where I'm not within my, lifestyle, way of life. Take my, don't leave it on Saturday.
But coming to the show on Friday nights obviously has a special meaning to you.
Yeah, it has a meeting.
And if you could, you would like to be able to
Yeah.
observe, but it's not that you've been able to.
Right.
I think that here we're probably discounting the example of people who have to work on Saturday for their living. We're not saying that that's the lack of observance, lack of faith, or lack of anything, it's just a part of real life.
I actually, one of these I come to services, most Friday nights is, I don't know when I might have to work a Saturday or not. All profession such that I have to do it, but the time I do. But I don't want to get that mental reset by coming to services. But if I was, when I was a young attorney in that firm, was known as a Jewish law firm. There were plenty of Orthodox, modern Orthodox Jews working there. And it didn't matter what their caseload was. They did not work. They left, make sure they were home by sundown. And I remember once I was an modern Orthodox Jew and I were going to do a trial. And he did preparation time, the post-trial briefs. It didn't matter. He might be working, and there's no working online back there, in the 80s. He might come in Saturday at sundown, work till midnight, then work all day Sunday. It didn't matter. And it actually worked out well because I could handle some things on Saturday, that he could. But seeing that was really my first exposure to it. Growing up reform in Long Island and Roslyn, it was like a foreign concept to me. Then I get to this firm, which have plenty of modern Orthodox Jews, and seeing how different people, some people would just, it was an absolute command, I guess. They were not, didn't matter how many hours they might bill for the week, none of those hours were gonna come, on Shabbat.
Well, that brings up an interesting example. I personally reject the concept of more observant. Right? As meaning better Jew or.
They were the kind of structure you're talking about that developed over the years, they obeyed that structure. It didn't matter to see that many people do that despite the workload was really an eye opener for me.
Okay, so we went to Israel, to the battle, and I thought Israel was gonna be religious. That kind of scary, but one day, it was a Friday, we went up to the Golden Heights, to the Jeep ride. And we learned about the Yom Kippur War, how it started there. And at the very end of the day, when we're getting on the Jeep to go back, the driver said, he's so happy that it's Friday, the start of Sabbath, favorite day of the week. He says it's so meaningful. And I asked him to explain how it's meaningful, and I expected him to give me a religious meaning. And he just said, it's the night that I'm so thankful I made it through the week and I'm still alive. And so that was the year 2000. And that almost like said everything to me about Israel, that it's not religious, but the feeling of your land, your country, just that feeling of being Jewish.
And we basically spent our whole time in Jerusalem and the Golan. We weren't in Tel Aviv. We weren't in secular Israel at all.
Especially when sundown comes and all the buses stop running, right? It just says, why is it so cold? These all the buses.
Yeah.
I was in Israel twice. First time was in college, and I was selected, or my parents got me selected, I don't know, for what's called a fact-finding mission for the Native Youth. And 12 other kids and I went as guests of the Israeli government. It was right after the Yom Kippur War, maybe 2 months afterwards. And the national guilt for, letting down their guard, etc., was a horrible piece of national guilt. So October 7th made me think of that, and well, the never again, we're never going to let down our guard again. Jeez. Didn't quite work out that way. The second time was the day after we left. We were walking around East Jerusalem. It was the most peaceful thing. The day after we left, Ariel Sharon goes up on the mosque, and everything changed. But the distinction between you know, just walking around and on your bus with 12 soldiers being transported from here to there in 1973, and walking around East Jerusalem by ourselves was such a hope that got dashed pretty quickly. Sorry. So how else do other people observe? What, again, the term observe is so nebulous and vague. They can be a thought, it can be an action or not an action. But I think what we're describing here is that mostly it becomes an attitude. And how you put that attitude into effect varies based on circumstance, but if you develop that kind of attitude, I think it's special.
I like your idea of remembrance. That was a very good word, I thought.
That's the
Because it's
original.
a good day for not just reflection. So I just started in the last year and a half or so going back to temple on Friday nights. And not this temple, but another. And it just seems to me that going on Friday night and then having whatever you do on Saturday, you know, swim, play tennis, play pickleball, whatever it is. It's just not doing that work that you make a living for. But also remembering thinking, that's a really good guidance. It's a very good one.
It's kind of interesting, given that example I gave of spending the day in shul with my father and how special it was when I got to walk home with him on Kol Nidre night. That was like, boy, I was old enough to walk home with friends. It's funny, later on, and actually, a couple months before he passed away, he had been reflecting on his whole life, basically. And one of the things he said was that he wishes that he would have taken off on a Saturday and come to one of my championship track meets. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that I'm happy you didn't. It would have been.
Was it so championship?
I didn't want somebody else to, I didn't want him to be a distraction, but it was kind of nice that he had that same feeling of, being together, being the special ingredient, not did he have to drive? Did I have to give up bowling? Whatever. But, so it was a feeling that he remembered 60 years, I guess. Something more.
Anybody have any thoughts if you have grandchildren who are really non-observant, how to discuss that with them? And ideas of how to let them know that, it's a day different than the other 6?
Joyce?
Well, we were discussing, that's why it was triggered in my
And
brain.
I told him that Noah called. Your grandma, I'm calling you all morning. Where were you? And I told him I went to temple. He has no idea about, he's not learning. And it's upsetting that it's a holiday, it could be any holiday.
How old are you?
He's 6. And he doesn't know the word temple, he doesn't know the word Jewish. And my son was in the background. Okay, I asked him once, didn't answer. And then when I asked again, I was waiting for my son to go, Mom, stop it, enough already. And because he doesn't like, that's an issue that I have, walk a lot. He has questions, but my son gets very annoyed because this is his family. He doesn't want kids to have religion. I think when they get older, they will. That's what he says. But they're 6 now. When is getting older? That he can. There's no school. He should. I feel like it's okay if he knows there's no school because it's a holiday. And
he thinks he can't conceptualize it, I guess.
but he doesn't try.
Our big boy is 14, and our big boy is 14. He was asking me forever.
For what?
Why I keep kosher. And I had trouble explaining it to him. Then he called me up. They were in France and said, Grandpa, I crossed one thing off my bucket list. I ate escargot. And it was really worth the wait. And then he said, you should try it, and then it dawned on him, he said, but you can't eat that because you're kosher, right? I said, that's right. And so at that moment, he asked again, and I had an answer this time. The dozens of times I didn't have an answer. I had the answer that he accepted it. It just wasn't because my father was or my grandfather was or it's healthy or whatever. It just said it makes me feel good about myself. And he got it, first of all, he had just reached the age where thinking abstractly became online for him, one of his capabilities. But that's what he got. And so he decided that when he got back, the other thing that was on his bucket list was sea bream. So I told him, when we get back, we'll buy some sea bream and make it special.
From what?
Sea bream, which can mean any Mediterranean fish. So he got it. It makes me feel good about myself. And that's the way we reason now. When he doesn't do his homework, does that make you feel good about yourself? When you give your father a hard time, does that make you feel good about yourself? And that seems to be one crack in the door.
So teach them by example, instead of teaching them by teaching them, teach them by having them see you and question what you do. And use that as
He knows what makes him feel good about himself and what doesn't.
right, exactly.
I think it's about joy and having fun for children. I mean, when I was in junior high school, my synagogue had a very active youth group. And because my friends were gonna be there, I walked a mile. My parents I had atheist parents. I mean, they were not, but we had drop off Judaism. It was just a place to send us. But I went there because, and I enjoyed it and wanted to know and I wanted to learn because they were there. That was a part of what the youth group was about. And but it's also very social, building of community for us as kids. That made it important to what was important to me, but I wasn't raised with that. There was very little ritual at home. It was,
And do you have grandchildren now?
yeah,
And
yeah, but
do they, if you ask them about the Sabbath, would they know what it was?
I don't think so,
no,
but
they go to they go
they
to
all go to
school,
Hebrew school. They all go to Hebrew
Sunday
school.
school.
I don't think the Sabbath is in play, but
Right.
I will say, I have had limited success in the high holy days. Just sort of simplifying everything, like for Rosh Hashanah. So we talked about, like I mentioned before, Adam and Eve. And that was one of the topics. And they both, and there's seven, how old are they? 8 and 8 and 6. Just about 8 and 6. And they both had great comments. One was directly from the religious school, because she goes, the other one was just, just out of the blue, but very relevant comments. The other thing I try to bring up every year, but it doesn't really go anywhere, is the pomegranate and the 613 mitzvot, which you had mentioned before. And I go through them every year, the 613, and I'm trying to find something of relevance that's meaningful. And it's difficult. It's really difficult to me. Well, these are our 613 rules. But to convert that into, today, something that they can get from it, that's a little bit more difficult. I get through on that and some other points, but it's that's the approach I take, and the same thing for Passover. I make it very simple,
Yep.
and
It's exposure.
I agree, that's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah.
Because I did not grow up with candles on Shabbat, and when I have friends that I've had that do that just routinely, it's foreign to me still. I mean, I just don't feel a connection to doing that. When I come to shul, I enjoy celebrating Shabbat, but to do it at home, it just, I know people that's what they do all the time, but it's not the language of my childhood, and nobody did that in my family. My grandmother would the only candle she lit was a yard side candle. But she was, you know, she was raised in a Jewish school in White Russia. And she took me to synagogue at the Orthodox synagogue, and she sat with me up in the balcony with the you know, like looking between the curtains down at the men down there. But and it was kind of boring, really. But it was but the women were separated. We didn't. There's no emphasis on us learning anything. And she, at the end of the day, she was told my cousins, I don't know, that she was atheist. So I don't know. I mean, but she grew up that way. I don't remember her lighting Shabbat candles. That was the only candle as the yard side.
I think I agree with making it fun and part of a conversation.
Yeah, and making it a routine. Like I kind of wish I grew up that way, where it was a ritual and that we were. It was a nice way to bring the family together. The families I haven't experienced that with. It's a nice way to bring everybody together and sit around. I've had friends that do that, and everybody, the whole family is there afterward, just hanging out. But
Yeah, I really liked the way this turned out because it wasn't only the kids, it was the adults still at the table sitting. And my son especially, like I said before, he went to this religious school, as I did. And he said, well, we didn't learn that about Adam and Eve, that there was another way of looking at at the story. And I mean, he thought that was very interesting. And it lasted about 5 or 10 minutes, the discussion on this. So I was very happy because the kids were, it's hard to get their attention, but they were actually listening a little bit.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I'm gonna show my ignorance. So tell me about the pomegranate.
I'm glad you asked that question because I don't want to show my ignorance
the-
again.
The pomegranate is supposed to have 613 seeds in.
So
Okay.
that's the relationship.
Right, so
Oh, yeah,
that's
now I-
what I have not been able to prove that scientifically.
Yeah, you counted them.
Yeah, I haven't counted them, and I don't think there's any
The
scientific
reason
research.
the reason I specifically asked this question, we were just in Florence a week ago. We went to the old synagogue in Florence, which is a magnificent building.
I can either put that in there too, after
Yeah.
a lot, but
Okay, well, in the yard of the synagogue, in the front yard of the synagogue, is groves of pomegranate trees on both sides. There's this beautiful plaza in front of this Moorish designed synagogue. And they're pomegranate trees and they were in full bloom when we were there. I didn't know why all these pomegranate trees were planted there. Now I know. Thank you.
Let me just mention a specific opportunity. So we're talking about grandchildren. Two of the greatest opportunities we have to influence our grandchildren. One is that when our grandchildren are at rebellious ages, they're much more likely to follow the ideals of their grandparents than their parents. And so that's, I try to present it that way to my grandchildren. But the other slightly more morbid one is that there's no more efficient time for someone to take on the traits of someone they love than after suffering a loss. So if you can, so if you have a certain ideal, then when we're gone, the odds of our grandchildren cherishing that ideal more than they did before the loss, it's really it's morbid, but it's a great opportunity. So, the bottom line is be emotionally open with your grandchildren when they're, depending on what age they are, they'll take it in different ways, but it's a very, very effective thing. Okay, so we have to stop now. Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.